My relationship didn't fall apart because of something big, but something small I ignored. I had absolutely no real understanding of personality patterns, emotional triggers, or the deeper psychological dynamics that can quietly shape a relationship long before things visibly fall apart. And if I'm being honest with myself now, I didn't even think I needed to understand any of that, because like most people, I assumed that if two people cared about each other enough, things would naturally work themselves out without needing to analyze every behavior or reaction. I had heard certain terms before, things like emotional triggers, attachment styles, or personality traits, but they were just words to me at the time, things people mentioned casually in conversations or online posts, and I never felt the need to actually sit down and understand what they meant in a real-life context, especially not in a way that could apply to my own relationship. Then I met her, and like so many stories begin, it didn't feel complicated at all in the beginning. In fact, it felt almost too easy, like everything had just fallen into place at the right time without any effort. And she came across as everything I thought I had been looking for, without even realizing it. She was kind in a way that felt genuine, not forced or performative, caring in a way that made me feel seen and appreciated, generous not just with things but with her time and attention, and affectionate in a way that made the connection feel warm, safe, and real. And naturally, I let my guard down, because nothing about her behavior gave me any reason to hold back. We connected quickly, and it didn't take long before I started to feel like I had finally met someone who understood me without needing too many explanations. Someone who matched my energy, my values, and my idea of what a relationship should feel like. And when that kind of connection happens, it's very easy to believe that you found something rare. Those first 6 months felt almost perfect, and I don't say that lightly, because there genuinely weren't any major issues, no serious arguments, no tension that lingered beneath the surface, and no signs that anything was off in a way that would make me question the direction we were heading. Everything felt stable, consistent, and emotionally fulfilling, and during that time, I allowed myself to fully invest in the relationship without hesitation, because from my perspective, there was nothing to be cautious about. I remember thinking to myself more than once that this was it, that this was the person I had been waiting for, and that all the past experiences I'd had were just leading up to this. And when you reach that point mentally, you stop looking for problems because you believe you've already found the solution. But looking back now, with the clarity that only comes after everything has ended, I can see that the shift didn't happen suddenly, the way it felt at the time. It started small, almost unnoticeable, and it came from something so insignificant that I didn't even register it as important in the moment. It was just a normal evening. I was at a friend's house, nothing out of the ordinary, just having a drink, playing darts, relaxing the way people do when they're comfortable, and not thinking about anything going wrong. And at some point during that night, I sent her a message. To this day, I can't even remember exactly what I said, which probably says everything about how minor it actually was. But I do remember that it wasn't exactly right in her eyes, and somehow, that small detail became the starting point of something much bigger than I could have anticipated. The response I got wasn't what I expected. In fact, it didn't feel like it came from the same person I had been getting to know over the past 6 months. And I remember very clearly having this strange, almost disorienting thought in my head as I was reading her messages and then speaking to her on the phone. Who is this? Not in a dramatic way, not in a confrontational way, but in a genuinely confused way, because the tone, the intensity, and the way she was reacting didn't match the version of her that I had built in my mind based on everything I had experienced up until that point. It felt like a switch had been flipped, like I was suddenly dealing with a completely different side of her that had never been visible before. And because it came out of nowhere over something so small, I didn't know how to process it properly. At the time, I brushed it off. I told myself it was just a bad moment, maybe stress, maybe something else going on that I didn't know about. And it felt easier to make excuses for it than to question it too deeply, because questioning it would have meant acknowledging that something might not be as perfect as I thought. And when things feel perfect, the last thing you want to do is start looking for cracks. So I ignored it. What I didn't realize then was that this was the first red flag, not because of the argument itself, but because of how quickly things escalated, how disproportionate the reaction felt compared to the situation, and how unfamiliar her behavior suddenly became. But hindsight has a way of making things obvious that were invisible in the moment. At that time, it was just one incident, just one confusing night, just something I thought wouldn't matter in the bigger picture. I had no idea that this would be the beginning of a pattern that would slowly, almost quietly, start to shape the entire dynamic of the relationship in ways I wasn't prepared for. At the time, I convinced myself that what had happened that night was nothing more than an isolated incident, just a moment where emotions ran a little higher than usual, something that could easily be explained away by stress, a misunderstanding, or simply bad timing. And because I wanted to believe in the version of the relationship I had experienced during those first 6 months, I didn't question it any further than that. But the problem with ignoring something that doesn't feel right is that it rarely stays as just one moment. It started happening again. Not immediately in a way that made everything obvious, but gradually, almost subtly, like small cracks forming beneath the surface before anything visibly breaks. And each time it happened, it was always over something that, to me, felt minor, almost insignificant. The kind of thing most people wouldn't even stop to think about, let alone turn into a serious issue. And yet, for her, it was never small. The reactions were always intense, immediate, and emotionally charged in a way that felt completely disproportionate to what had actually happened. And every time it caught me off guard because there was no clear buildup, no gradual escalation, just a sudden shift from calm to confrontation, like a switch being flipped without warning. One moment, everything would feel normal, relaxed, even good. And the next, I would find myself in the middle of a situation where I was being questioned, criticized, or misunderstood in a way that didn't align with my intentions at all. And that was the part that started to confuse me the most. It wasn't just the reactions themselves. It was how quickly she seemed to form conclusions about what I meant, what I was thinking, or what my intentions were. And no matter how much I tried to explain myself calmly and clearly, it felt like my words weren't actually being heard in the way I intended them. It was as if she had already decided what the situation meant before I even had a chance to clarify it. I remember trying, over and over again, to bring things back to a level of understanding, to explain my perspective without getting defensive, to reassure her that there was no hidden meaning behind what I said or did. But those explanations rarely made a difference. In fact, sometimes it felt like they made things worse. Because instead of resolving the issue, it would turn into another layer of the same conflict, where now I wasn't just addressing the original misunderstanding, but also trying to defend why my explanation should even be believed in the first place. And that's when I started to notice something changing in myself. Without realizing it at first, I began to think more carefully before saying anything. not in a healthy, thoughtful way, but in a cautious, almost guarded way, where I would mentally run through different versions of what I wanted to say just to avoid triggering another reaction. I started asking myself questions I had never needed to ask in a relationship before. Is this going to be taken the wrong way? Should I word this differently? Is it even worth saying this at all? And slowly, without making a conscious decision, I began to filter myself. Not because I wanted to hide anything, but because I was trying to maintain peace. But the more I tried to avoid conflict, the more it felt like conflict found its way in anyway. There didn't seem to be a consistent pattern I could follow to prevent it. No clear set of rules that, if I followed them correctly, would keep things stable. And that unpredictability started to create a kind of underlying tension that never fully went away. It was like being in a state of low-level alert without realizing it. Always aware, always slightly on edge, even during good moments. There was a part of me that wondered how long it would last before something shifted again. She would often say that she felt triggered, a word that, at the time, didn't hold much meaning for me because I didn't really use it or fully understand it. And I remember thinking how frequently it came up, how easily it seemed to apply to situations that, from my perspective, didn't seem to warrant that level of emotional response. I tried to understand it, I really did, but understanding something in theory and experiencing it repeatedly in real life are two very different things, because when those moments happened, it wasn't just about acknowledging that she felt triggered. It was about navigating the intensity that came with it, the accusations, the assumptions, the emotional weight of being placed in a position where I felt like I had done something wrong without fully understanding what that was. And even when it was clearly a misunderstanding, even when I could logically explain what I meant and why there was no negative intention behind it, there was often no acceptance of that explanation. It was like the conclusion had already been reached, and anything I said after that was just seen as an attempt to justify something that, in her mind, had already been defined. That cycle started to repeat itself, over and over again. Different situations, same pattern, and each time it happened, it took a little more out of me. Not in a dramatic, obvious way at first, but in a gradual, almost unnoticed way. Like small pieces of my energy, my patience, and my sense of ease within the relationship were being chipped away little by little. I didn't suddenly feel overwhelmed. I didn't suddenly feel like I was losing myself, but I was changing, adapting, adjusting my behavior in ways I had never needed to before, trying to find a balance that, no matter how hard I looked for it, always seemed just out of reach. And the hardest part was that I still believed in the relationship. I still believed in her. I still held on to the version of us that existed in the beginning, hoping that somehow things would settle, that whatever was causing these reactions would pass, and that we would return to the stability we once had. Because when things were good, they were still good, and that made everything else harder to fully accept. It created this internal conflict where I was constantly weighing the good against the bad, the calm against the chaos, the connection against the confusion, and convincing myself that the good was enough to balance everything else out. But deep down, without fully admitting it to myself yet, I had already started walking on eggshells. And once that starts, it's very difficult to go back to feeling completely at ease again. As time went on, and these patterns became more frequent, what started as confusion slowly turned into something heavier, something that was harder to ignore and even harder to navigate, because it wasn't just about sudden emotional reactions anymore. It began to affect how I was being understood as a person at a much deeper level. One of the most exhausting parts of the relationship, something that gradually became a consistent pattern, was the way she would tell me what I was thinking, what I was feeling, or what my intentions were, even when those assumptions were completely disconnected from my actual reality. no matter how calmly or clearly I tried to explain myself, it often felt like I was speaking into a space where my words didn't carry any real weight. It wasn't just occasional misunderstandings, it became a recurring dynamic. She would say things with certainty, as if they were facts, about what was going on in my mind, and every single time, it would be the complete opposite of what I was actually feeling, which then put me in this position where I wasn't just expressing myself naturally, I was constantly having to correct a version of myself that I didn't recognize, and that process was draining in a way that's difficult to explain unless you've experienced it, because it's not just about disagreement, it's about feeling like your own sense of reality is being overwritten in real time. I would find myself saying things like, "That's not what I meant," or "That's not how I feel," or "You're misunderstanding me," over and over again, hoping that eventually something would click, that she would pause and consider my perspective as valid. But more often than not, it didn't land the way I hoped it would. Instead, it would turn into another layer of conflict, another loop, another argument where I was trying to defend not just my actions, but my character, my intentions, and even my own internal experience. And over time, that kind of dynamic starts to wear you down. At the same time, she had opened up about something that, on its own, I took seriously and wanted to be understanding of. Her fear of abandonment and rejection, something she expressed in a way that made it clear it wasn't just a passing insecurity, but something deeply rooted that influenced how she experienced the relationship. And initially, I approached that with empathy. I wanted to be someone who made her feel safe, someone who reassured her, someone who didn't reinforce those fears, because that's what you do when you care about someone. You try to meet them where they are, emotionally. But what I didn't fully understand at the time was how that fear would begin to shape the expectations placed on me. Because slowly, almost without it being directly stated, it started to feel like saying no to anything, no matter how reasonable or small, wasn't just a simple boundary. It was interpreted as rejection, as a lack of care, or even as a sign that I was pulling away. And that created a tension I had never experienced before. Because on one hand, I wanted to be supportive and understanding, but on the other hand, I knew that a healthy relationship requires two people, not one person, constantly adjusting while the other's needs take priority in every situation. So I held on to that boundary. I didn't say yes to everything. I didn't agree to things that didn't feel right, just to avoid conflict. And every time I did that, it came at a cost. Arguments, frustration, escalation. It felt like standing my ground, even in the most reasonable way, would trigger a reaction that turned a small situation into something much bigger. And over time, those moments became more frequent and more intense. It got to a point where I could almost predict how certain conversations would go. Not because I wanted to assume the worst, but because the pattern had repeated itself so many times that it started to feel inevitable. And yet, despite recognizing that pattern, I still found myself caught in it, still trying to explain, still trying to find a way to be understood, still hoping that if I just communicated clearly enough, calmly enough, consistently enough, something would shift. But the reality was, the more I tried to clarify, the more I felt misunderstood. And the more I felt misunderstood, the more I felt the need to explain. And that loop became exhausting. Not in a sudden, overwhelming way, but in a slow, persistent way that built up over time like a constant pressure that never fully released. There were moments where I would step back mentally and think, why does this feel so difficult? Because relationships aren't supposed to feel like a constant effort to prove who you are. They're not supposed to feel like you're in a position where your words are consistently questioned or reinterpreted into something they were never meant to be. And yet, that's exactly where I found myself. At the same time, I could feel myself changing in ways I didn't like. I was becoming more defensive, more reactive, less patient than I used to be. And I was aware of it as it was happening, which made it even more frustrating, because I knew this wasn't how I normally handled situations. I remember thinking very clearly at one point that no one else in my life brought this side out of me. Not my friends, not my family, no one. And that realization stuck with me, because it made me question not just the situation, but who I was becoming within it. But even then, I didn't fully step away. I didn't fully accept that something deeper was wrong, because there were still moments, good moments, that made everything feel worth holding on to. Moments where things felt normal again, connected, calm, and those moments made it easy to reset, to tell myself that things were improving, that maybe we were just going through a phase, that maybe with enough effort, enough patience, enough understanding, we would find our way back to something stable. But what I didn't realize at the time was that I was slowly losing my footing, not all at once, not in a way that was obvious, but piece by piece, until the version of the relationship I was holding onto in my mind started to feel further and further away from the reality I was actually living in. By this stage, the shift wasn't subtle anymore. What had once been occasional tension had now turned into something that felt constant, something that sat in the background of the relationship even during moments that were supposed to feel calm. And without realizing exactly when it happened, I had fully stepped into a version of myself that was always alert, always cautious, and always trying to prevent the next conflict before it even had a chance to begin. Walking on eggshells wasn't just a phrase anymore. It had become my default state. Every word I chose, every message I sent, every decision I made, no matter how small, was filtered through this constant awareness of how it might be received, how it might be interpreted, and whether it might trigger another reaction. And the mental effort it took to maintain that level of awareness day after day started to wear me down in a way that I couldn't ignore anymore. At the same time, the criticism became more frequent, and not just occasional frustration or disagreement. The kind of criticism that feels constructive or momentary, but something more persistent, more personal, and more difficult to separate from how I saw myself. It wasn't always direct. Sometimes it came through tone, sometimes through implications, sometimes through the way past situations were brought back into the present as if they had never really been resolved. Mistakes, real or perceived, were never just left in the past. They were stored, remembered, revisited, and used again in future arguments, often in ways that made it feel like no matter what I did in the present, I was still being judged based on things that had already happened long ago. I would find myself in arguments where the original issue had almost disappeared, replaced by a list of past situations being brought up one after another, creating this overwhelming sense that I wasn't just dealing with one problem. I was defending my entire history within the relationship. And that's when the arguments stopped feeling like they had a clear beginning or end. They became circular, repeating the same points, revisiting the same accusations, going over the same explanations that never seemed to fully land, no matter how many times I tried to clarify them. It felt like being stuck in a loop where resolution was always just out of reach, where no matter how much effort I put into explaining, understanding, or resolving, the outcome remained the same. And over time, that kind of pattern starts to change how you see yourself. Because when you're constantly being told, directly or indirectly, that you're the one causing the problem, that your intentions are wrong, that your actions are hurtful, even when they weren't meant to be, it becomes harder to hold on to your own sense of clarity. You start questioning yourself, second-guessing your own reactions, wondering if maybe you are the problem, even when something inside you is telling you that the situation doesn't feel right. And at the same time, something else started to stand out in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. The timing of the arguments. It wasn't random. It followed a pattern that became more and more noticeable the longer it went on. Special occasions, moments that were supposed to bring us closer, moments that should have been associated with positive memories, somehow became the exact moments where everything would unravel. Anniversaries, birthdays, Christmas, Valentine's Day, holidays we had planned together. Time and time again, something small would happen. Something that, under normal circumstances, wouldn't have mattered, and it would escalate into a full argument, often starting in the morning and setting the tone for the entire day. It got to a point where I started to anticipate it, not consciously at first, but there was always this underlying thought in the back of my mind. Is something going to go wrong today? And when that thought starts to exist, it changes the experience of those moments completely. They stop feeling special. They start feeling fragile, easily disrupted, almost like they're waiting to fall apart. I remember even saying to my mom at one point that it felt like she was ruining every special occasion we had. And even as I said it, I didn't fully understand why it kept happening, only that it did, consistently enough to no longer feel like coincidence. But despite all of this, I still made excuses. I told myself it could be stress, hormones, external pressures, anything that would make it feel temporary, anything that would allow me to believe that this wasn't the true nature of the relationship, but just a phase we were going through, because accepting it as something deeper would have meant facing a reality I wasn't ready to fully acknowledge yet. At the same time, I could feel the toll it was taking on me, not just emotionally, but physically. There was a constant tension in my body, a level of stress that didn't fully go away, even when things were quiet, even when there wasn't an argument happening. And without realizing it at first, that stress started to affect other parts of the relationship too. My energy, my patience, my ability to feel relaxed in her presence, and eventually, my desire for intimacy. That part was confusing at the time, because it didn't feel like a conscious choice. It wasn't that I didn't care. It wasn't that I wasn't attracted to her, but something in me had started to shut down, to pull back, to create distance in ways I didn't fully understand while it was happening. I would make excuses, avoid closeness, not because I wanted to hurt her, but because something in me didn't feel safe enough to fully open up in the way I used to. And instead of that being understood as a reaction to everything that had been building over time, it became another source of conflict, another reason for her to feel rejected, another situation where I was seen as the one creating distance, rather than someone responding to it. And that's when it hit me, slowly but clearly. My body had already started reacting to the situation, long before my mind fully accepted what was happening. The stress, the tension, the emotional exhaustion, it had all been building quietly in the background until it started to show itself in ways I couldn't ignore anymore. And somewhere in all of this, I realized something that was hard to admit. I wasn't just trying to hold the relationship together anymore. I was trying to hold myself together within it, because the version of me that had entered this relationship, the one who felt secure, calm, and confident in who he was, felt very different from the version of me that existed now, more reactive, more drained, less certain, and I didn't like that version of myself. I remember thinking very clearly, this isn't who I am, and yet, it was who I had become in this environment. And no matter how much I tried to manage it, to control my reactions, to stay patient and composed, there's only so much pressure a person can take before something starts to break. Because the truth is, if you push someone enough times, eventually they will react. Not because that's who they are, but because that's what constant pressure creates. And when I finally started reacting emotionally as well, when I reached a point where I couldn't just absorb everything calmly anymore, it didn't lead to understanding. It didn't lead to resolution. It simply became another piece of evidence that could be used against me, another way for the situation to turn, another reason for her to position herself as the victim. And that was the moment where everything became clear in a way it hadn't before. Not all at once, not in a dramatic realization, but in a quiet, undeniable understanding that had been building over time. This wasn't just a difficult phase. This wasn't something that was going to fix itself with more effort, more patience, or more understanding. This was the dynamic, and it had been shaping itself for a long time. I had just taken longer to fully see it for what it was. And by the time I did, something in me had already started letting go.